The most powerful man in the room laughed at her. Not quietly, not privately. He laughed the way men like him always laughed, openly, carelessly, certain that the world would laugh with him. And it did, because it always had. She was standing near the entrance of the Pembury ballroom when it happened. The chandeliers were blazing. The music was perfectly timed. 300 of London's finest were arranged in their usual constellations, titles gravitating toward titles, wealth circling wealth, beauty deployed like a weapon by those who had learned early how to use it. Clara Whitmore had not learned that particular lesson. Not yet. She had learned other things. How to read a balance sheet at 14. How to sit across from men twice her age and hold her ground without raising her voice. How to walk into a room in Boston and command it without anyone quite understanding how she had done so. But London was not Boston, and the Pembury Ball was not a boardroom. She heard the laughter before she understood it was directed at her. Her name had just been announced, Miss Clara Whitmore of Boston, and something in the way she said thank you to the footman, something in the round, unhurried vowels of it, had carried across the marble floor to where the Duke of Hartwell stood with his usual circle of admirers. One word. That was all he said. Colonial. The word landed like a pin dropped in a quiet room. Small. Precise. Devastating. The titters followed immediately, soft, polished, practiced. The kind of laughter that doesn't crease a gown or disturb a hairstyle. Society laughter. Laughter that says, we see you and we have already decided. Clara Whitmore stood very still. She did not flush. She did not look at her shoes. She did not reach for her cousin Margaret's arm, though Margaret was standing right beside her, already pretending to examine the floral arrangement on the nearest pillar. Clara turned her head slowly and looked directly at the Duke of Hartwell. He was exactly what she had been warned he would be. Tall, immaculate, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that portrait painters loved and mothers pointed out to their daughters. He was laughing still, not cruelly, which almost made it worse. Carelessly, as though she were a small, momentary amusement between more important things. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away, smoothed her glove, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, and moved into the room as though nothing had happened at all. Edward Ashford, Duke of Hartwell, watched her go. He would tell himself later that he forgot about her within the hour. He was wrong about that. As it turned out, he would be wrong about Clara Whitmore in almost every way that mattered. And by the time he understood that, truly understood it, she would be holding the one thing he could not afford to lose. The Pembury Ball was considered the true opening of the London season. Not the first event, but the important one, the one where reputations were established, alliances were signaled, and mistakes were made that would take years to undo. Clara had arrived in London 11 days earlier, aboard the RMS Orania, with 2 trunks, a leather satchel of documents, and no particular interest in the social season whatsoever. She was 24 years old. She had buried her father at 19, watched her grandfather age a decade in a single year of grief, and spent the 5 years since learning everything Solomon Whitmore could teach her about how money moved through the world, quietly, invisibly, and with extraordinary power. Solomon had not wanted her to come to London. The English are particular, he had said, standing at the dock in Boston, his breath fogging in the March cold. They smile at your face and count your grandfather's sins behind your back. Then it's fortunate, Clara had replied, kissing his cheek, that I know how to count too. He had laughed at that, reluctantly, the way he always laughed, as though amusement were something to be rationed. Then he had pressed a sealed envelope into her hands. For the London office. not to be opened until you are inside and the door is closed. She had kept her word. She always did. The London office of Whitmore and Associates occupied a quiet, serious building on Threadneedle Street that gave nothing away from the outside. No grand signage. No gilded lettering. Just a number and a door of very good oak. Clara had learned early that real money did not advertise itself. Real money simply existed, steady and vast, like a river that had been running long before you arrived and would run long after you left. She had settled into her grandfather's London rooms, met with the office manager, a careful, pale man named Mr. Horace Finch, and spent her first week in England doing exactly what she had come to do, reviewing accounts, signing correspondence, and understanding the full picture of Whitmore's London operations. It was on the 5th day that she had first seen the name. Hartwell Estate. It was listed in a thick leather ledger that Mr. Finch had placed before her with the careful movements of a man handling something delicate. The numbers were significant. The terms were clear. And the status of the account was marked in red ink in her grandfather's own handwriting, in default. Monitor closely. Do not extend. Clara had read the page twice. Then she had looked up at Mr. Finch. How long? 3 years of deterioration, Miss Whitmore. The current Duke inherited the title and the debt simultaneously. He has made partial payments, enough to suggest effort, not enough to suggest resolution. Does he know the full picture? Mr. Finch had hesitated. His solicitor does. Whether the Duke himself has been fully informed, that I cannot say with certainty. Clara had nodded slowly. Closed the ledger. Set it aside. She had not thought about the Duke of Hartwell again, not in any meaningful way, until the night of the Pembury ball, when Margaret had insisted she attend, and a man with a perfect jaw and careless eyes had found her accent amusing. Margaret Whitmore was Clara's cousin on her mother's side, English by birth, relentlessly pleasant by strategy, and possessed of the particular skill of being completely present in a room while somehow never being responsible for anything that happened in it. She had collected Clara from her grandfather's rooms on the evening of the ball, with the energy of someone who had been planning this moment for weeks. You must come, she had said, already adjusting Clara's hair without asking permission. Everyone will be there. It is the only event that truly matters. I am here for 3 months, Margaret. I will have time for events. You will have time for the wrong events if you don't establish yourself correctly from the beginning. Margaret had stepped back, examined her, tilted her head. You look well. The dress is a little American. But well. Clara had let that pass. She had not dressed to impress London. She had dressed as she always dressed, cleanly, well, without apology. The gown was deep green silk, simply cut, without the excessive ornamentation that seemed to be fashionable this season. She wore her mother's pearl earrings, which were very good pearls, though nobody in London would know that on sight. She had walked into the Pembury ballroom beside her cousin and felt, for the first time, what her grandfather had meant on the dock. The English were particular. She felt it in the way eyes moved across her, assessing, cataloging, finding the unfamiliar and marking it. She was not plain. She was not poorly dressed. But she was not known. And in a room like this, being unknown was its own kind of flaw. She had accepted it, lifted her chin slightly, moved forward, and then her name had been announced, and she had thanked the footman naturally, warmly in her own voice, and the Duke of Hartwell had said his one word. Colonial. She did not speak of it to Margaret on the carriage ride home. Margaret did not bring it up either, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how Margaret had received it, with relief, possibly, that the attention had landed on Clara and not on her. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the London streets pass outside the window and thought about the Hartwell ledger. The red ink. In default. The number £312,000, at last accounting. She thought about the man who had laughed. The ease of him. The absolute, unexamined certainty that the world was arranged correctly, that he was at its center, and that everything on its edges was there for his amusement. She thought about her grandfather's voice. They smile at your face and count your grandfather's sins behind your back. Then she thought, and I will smile at theirs and count everything else. She was not angry. That was the thing Margaret would not have understood if Clara had tried to explain it. The laugh had not wounded her. It had simply given her information. It had shown her exactly who Edward Ashford was, underneath the jaw and the title and the effortless London belonging. He was a man who did not look carefully at things. In Clara's experience, men who did not look carefully at things made very expensive mistakes. The next morning, she returned to the Threadneedle Street office. She asked Mr. Finch to pull the Hartwell file in full, not just the summary but the complete correspondence, the original loan terms, her grandfather's notes, all of it. Mr. Finch set the stack on the desk before her. It was considerable. She spent 4 hours reading every page. When she was finished, she sat back in her grandfather's chair and looked at the window for a long moment. The London sky was the particular gray of a city that had been gray for centuries and saw no reason to change. Then she straightened the papers, stacked them neatly, returned them to Mr. Finch. "Thank you, Horace," she said. She had decided on the first day to call him Horace, which had startled him considerably and seemed to have done him some good. "That will be all for this afternoon. Shall I make a note of your review for your grandfather's records?" "Yes," said Clara. "Note that I reviewed the file. Note that no action was taken at this time." She paused at the door. "And Horace, who else has access to this information?" "Outside of this office." "Only the Duke's solicitor, Miss Whitmore. It is a matter of strict confidence." "Good," said Clara. "Keep it that way." She went back to the social circuit that evening. Lady Harrow's musical evening. She wore a different dress, ivory this time with her mother's pearls again. She smiled at everyone. She was warm, genuinely curious, asked people about themselves, and listened to the answers. She danced twice with a perfectly agreeable baronet who seemed surprised to find her charming. She did not seek out the Duke of Hartwell, but she positioned herself twice during the evening exactly where he would see her laughing, relaxed, entirely at home, and each time she felt his gaze find her across the room, she did not return it. Let him wonder, she thought. Let him wonder what, exactly, he had laughed at. Edward Ashford had not survived 3 years of quietly catastrophic debt by being stupid. He was many things proud, certainly. Careless with words, as the Pembury ball had demonstrated. Accustomed to a world that arranged itself around his convenience. But he was not stupid. And when something required his full attention, he was capable of a focus that surprised people who had mistaken his ease for laziness. Clara Whitmore had his full attention. He told himself in the beginning that it was purely practical. He needed a wealthy wife before the end of the season. That was the simple, brutal truth of it, a truth he had been avoiding for 2 years, repackaging in softer language, calling it securing the estate's future or fulfilling his responsibilities to the Hartwell name. But at 3 in the morning, when the house was quiet and the ledgers were open on his desk, he knew what it actually was. He was running out of time. His solicitor, Mr. Gerald Prout, had been delivering the same message with increasing urgency for 18 months. The Whitmore Bank, a private institution, Boston-based, with a London office that operated like a sealed room, telling nothing to anyone, held the majority of the Hartwell debt. It had been accumulated across 2 generations. His father's grand renovations, his grandfather's political ambitions, the kind of spending that looks like prosperity from the outside, and is revealed as ruin only after the men responsible for it are safely dead. Edward had inherited the title at 28. He had inherited the debt at the same moment, though it had taken Prout 6 months to present it to him in its full dimensions. He remembered that morning with perfect clarity. Prout's careful voice. The papers spread across the desk. The number £312,000, written in red ink in a hand he didn't recognize. "Whose handwriting is that?" he had asked. "The bank's principal, Your Grace." "A Mr. Solomon Whitmore. He reviews each account personally." Edward had looked at the number for a long time. Then he had said, "How long do I have?" And Prout had said, "If you are careful, 2 years, perhaps 3. After that, the bank has the right to call it in. And from everything I understand of Mr. Whitmore, he is not a sentimental man." That had been 3 years ago. Edward had been careful. He had made partial payments, enough to demonstrate good faith, not enough to make any real difference. He had sold 2 smaller properties. He had declined certain expenses. He had smiled at every event, danced with every suitable young woman, and searched, with the desperation of a man who cannot let desperation show, for a solution that would not destroy him. He needed money. He needed it in the form of a wife. And he needed it before Solomon Whitmore, whoever he was, decided that good faith was no longer sufficient. It was in this context that he began to notice Clara Whitmore. He had dismissed her at the Pembury ball. He recognized that now, not with guilt, exactly, but with the particular discomfort of a man who has made a careless move in a game that matters. He had seen an unfamiliar face, heard an unfamiliar voice, and reached for the easiest available response. It had been automatic, thoughtless. The way she had looked at him afterward was not automatic or thoughtless. It was the most deliberate thing he had seen in a long time. 3 seconds. Direct. Entirely without fear or pleading. And then she had simply moved on. As though he were a minor inconvenience she had already resolved. He had thought about those 3 seconds more than he would ever admit to anyone. He began to pay attention at subsequent events. Lady Harrow's musical evening. She had been there in ivory, laughing with a group near the windows. She had not looked for him. He had found himself looking for her. Lord Pembury's dinner. She had been seated at the far end of the table, engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation with old Lord Ashworth about railway investments. Lord Ashworth, who spoke to almost no one under 50 with any genuine interest, had been leaning forward in his chair. The Cavendish afternoon reception. He had watched her navigate 3 separate conversations in the space of 20 minutes, moving between them with the ease of someone who was genuinely interested in people, not performing interest for effect. He knew the difference. He had spent his whole life in rooms full of people performing. He had asked, carefully and indirectly, about her circumstances. The answers were frustratingly vague. She was a Whitmore American branch. Her father had died some years ago. She was in London on family business of some kind. She was staying in private rooms, not with relations. She had no chaperone beyond her cousin Margaret, which was either scandalously independent or entirely proper, depending on who was characterizing it. As for her money, nobody seemed to know exactly. She spent carefully but not poorly. Her clothes were good without being excessive. She did not discuss finances, which in Edward's experience meant either that there were none, or that there were so many they didn't require discussion. He needed to know which. He chose Lady Fenton's garden party as his moment. It was a Thursday in late May, warm enough to be pleasant, the kind of afternoon that made London briefly resemble somewhere worth living. The garden was arranged with its usual careful beauty. Roses in early bloom, white chairs, small tables with cold lemonade that nobody actually wanted but everyone accepted. Clara was standing near the rose border with Margaret and two other women when he approached. He watched her register his arrival from several feet away, a slight adjustment in her posture, nothing more. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and produced his best smile. He knew precisely how effective it was. He had been deploying it since he was 17. "I don't believe I have had the opportunity to be properly introduced." "You had an opportunity of a different kind at the Pembury ball," she said pleasantly. "Though I understand if it has slipped your memory." Margaret made a small, strangled sound beside her. Edward held his expression. "I was hoping," he said, "to offer an apology for that evening." Clara tilted her head. Her eyes were a clear, cool gray, the kind that seemed to be measuring something without making a production of it. "That's very gracious of you, Your Grace. Will you walk with me? The roses are particularly fine this year." She considered this for a moment, not coyly, not with false hesitation, but as someone who was actually deciding. Then she said, "Of course," and handed her lemonade glass to Margaret without looking at her. They walked along the rose border. Edward was careful. He was charming, genuinely so, when he chose to be asking her about Boston, about her crossing, about what had surprised her most about London. She answered easily, with dry observations that made him laugh twice before he had intended to. She was, he realized, very good at conversation. Not in the way that young women were trained to be, agreeable, reflective, designed to make the man feel brilliant. She was good at it in the way that people who actually think are good at it. She pushed back lightly. She asked questions that assumed he had real opinions. She listened to his answers as though she expected them to be interesting. He found, disconcertingly, that he was trying to be interesting. "You came to London alone," he said after a while. "That is unconventional. My grandfather felt I was capable of managing the journey. And the season. I'm not here for the season, Your Grace. I'm here on business." "What sort of business?" She smiled, the first full smile she had given him, and it changed her face considerably. "The sort that keeps bankers in business." He laughed at that, and then stopped laughing because something had moved at the edge of his mind. "Bankers." He looked at her. "Whitmore." He thought of the red ink on the ledger page. The name his solicitor had said 3 years ago. Solomon Whitmore. He kept his expression completely still. He was good at that. It was perhaps his most useful skill. "Your family is in banking?" he asked. "Casual. Conversational." "My grandfather is," she said. "Among other things." "Remarkable." "He is," she agreed, and her tone held something pride, certainly, but also something more complicated. Something that closed the subject. Edward did not press. He filed it away instead. He returned home that evening and sent for Prout. The solicitor arrived within the hour, slightly breathless, his usual leather case under his arm. "The Whitmore Bank," Edward said without preamble. "Tell me everything you know about the family." Prout sat down slowly. "The principal is Solomon Whitmore. Boston. 71 years of age. Built the bank from a small lending operation started by his own father. Extremely private. Does not participate in the social world. Has one surviving child, a daughter, who I believe married an American some years ago and is now deceased. There may be grandchildren. Edward was very still. Grandchildren. I believe so, Your Grace. Though I have no specific. Is there a granddaughter? Edward asked. Named Clara. Prude stopped. Looked at him. I would need to verify. Verify it, said Edward quietly. Tonight if possible. After Prude left, Edward sat alone in his study for a long time. The fire had burned low. He didn't rebuild it. He sat in the cooling room and looked at nothing in particular and thought about a pair of gray eyes that measured without performing, and a smile that had changed a face, and 3 seconds of silence that had unsettled him at the Pembury ball. He thought about the red ink. In default. He thought about the word he had said, colonial, and how it had landed, and how she had absorbed it without flinching, without tears, without the wounded pride that would have made him feel powerful. She had looked at him for 3 seconds, and then she had moved on, as though she already knew something he didn't. Margaret came to Clara's rooms 2 days later, unannounced, which was her habit, arriving with the air of someone delivering urgent news they have been rehearsing since breakfast. The Duke, she said, settling herself into the best chair without being invited, has been asking about you. Clara was at the writing desk, reviewing correspondence. She did not look up immediately. Has he? Lady Fenton told Mrs. Cavendish, who told me directly, he has been making inquiries. About your family. About your grandfather. Margaret paused for effect. About money. Clara set down her pen. Looked at her cousin with genuine interest. And what has he learned? Nothing specific. Your grandfather's affairs are apparently very closed. Margaret said this with a slight tone of complaint, as though the privacy were personally inconvenient to her. But Clara, the Duke of Hartwell, do you understand what that means? If he is interested. He is interested in what my grandfather is worth, Clara said. Not in me. Does it matter? A duke is a... Margaret, Clara's voice was not sharp. It was simply final. I know what a duke is. Margaret subsided. She smoothed her skirt. Then in a smaller voice, he is very handsome. Yes, said Clara. He is. She picked up her pen again. But she did not immediately write anything. She was thinking about the garden party. About the moment she had mentioned bankers, the almost imperceptible shift in him. The stillness. She had seen it. She was quite sure he didn't know she had seen it. He was beginning to understand. Good. Let him understand slowly. Let him arrange it in his mind, the Whitmore name, the London office, the grandfather who did not appear in society but whose handwriting appeared on ledgers all over England. Let him arrive at the conclusion himself. Men like Edward Ashford trusted conclusions they reached on their own. It was one of the most expensive habits they had. The letter from Prude arrived on a Thursday morning. Edward was at breakfast when it came. He opened it before his coffee had cooled. It was brief. Prude was thorough but not verbose. The granddaughter's name is Clara Emmeline Whitmore. She arrived in London on the 14th of April, aboard the RMS Orania. She is understood to be managing the London affairs of Whitmore and Associates during her grandfather's absence. She holds, by my understanding, full authority to act on the bank's behalf in all matters during this period. All matters, Your Grace. I feel I should make that phrase very clear. Edward read the letter twice. Then he folded it precisely and set it beside his plate. Outside the dining room window, London moved through its morning. Carriages, vendors, the distant sound of a church bell marking the hour. Ordinary. Indifferent. He thought about a green silk dress. A pair of gray eyes. A woman who had stood in a ballroom and absorbed his cruelty, and looked at him for 3 seconds, and decided he wasn't worth her anger. She had known. At the Pembury ball, or very shortly after, she had known exactly who he was and what he owed and to whom. And she had said nothing. She had smiled at Lady Harrows, discussed railways with Lord Ashworth, walked with him through Lady Fenton's roses, and talked about her grandfather with that complicated note of pride. And when he had asked about banking, she had smiled and given him exactly enough, the sort that keeps bankers in business, and watched him file it away. She had been watching him figure it out. The realization arrived cold and complete, like stepping into a room with no fire. She was not here for the season. She was here for him. The only question, the question that would keep him awake until he had answered it, was whether that meant he had a chance, or whether he had already lost. The Whitmore London office on Threadneedle Street received very few unannounced visitors. This was by design. The building did not encourage casual entry. The oak door was heavy. The number beside it was small. There was no bell. You knocked, and a man opened the door and looked at you in a way that made you immediately aware of whether you had an appointment or not. Edward Ashford did not have an appointment. He had stood on the pavement outside for approximately 40 seconds before knocking, long enough to consider leaving, short enough that he could tell himself he hadn't hesitated. He was dressed plainly by his standards. No carriage. He had walked from his club on purpose, needing the 20 minutes to arrange his face into something that did not reveal the precise nature of his desperation. He was not certain he had succeeded. The man who opened the door looked at him without expression. Edward gave his name. There was a pause, brief, deliberate, and then he was shown inside. The interior was exactly what he should have expected, and somehow wasn't. Quiet, well-ordered, dark wood and good lamplight, and the faint smell of ink and paper that meant serious work was done here. No excess, no display. Everything saying, in the language of understatement that Edward understood very well, "We have nothing to prove." He was shown to a room on the first floor and asked to wait. He waited for 4 minutes. He counted them. Then the door opened. He had prepared, on the walkover, for several possibilities. An elderly male clerk. A solicitor acting as intermediary. Some formal apparatus of the bank, designed to keep the actual power at a comfortable remove from the people who needed it. He had not prepared for Clara Whitmore, sitting behind a large mahogany desk with a file open before her and a pen in her hand, looking up at him with those gray eyes that measured everything and performed nothing. She did not stand. She did not appear surprised. She simply looked at him for a moment, the same quality of look she had given him at the Pembury ball, though now there was no ballroom around it, no music, no 300 witnesses. Just the two of them and the desk between them, and the file that he had no doubt contained his name. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He did not sit. She had not invited him to, and he was finding in this room that he was disinclined to do anything she had not sanctioned. "I didn't know," he said. It came out more directly than he intended. "At the Pembury ball. I didn't know who you were." "I know," she said. "But you knew who I was." A pause. "I suspected. By the next morning I was certain." He absorbed this. "And you said nothing. You never asked the right question, Your Grace." He looked at her. She was perfectly composed, not cold, not triumphant. Simply present, in the way that people who are very sure of their ground are present. Occupying the room without effort. "What is the right question?" he asked. She closed the file, folded her hands on top of it. That depends entirely on why you came here today. Edward had rehearsed this too. On the walk. In his mind at 3 in the morning for the past 4 nights. He had rehearsed a version that was gracious. One that was direct. One that acknowledged the Pembury ball with sufficient contrition, and then moved efficiently to the practical matter at hand. He had even, in his worst moments, rehearsed a version that attempted charm, which, in daylight and in this room, he recognized immediately would be the single most catastrophic approach available to him. He used none of them. Instead, he said simply, "I came to discuss the Hartwell account." "I see. I understand you hold full authority on behalf of your grandfather during your time in London." "I do." "Then I would like to speak with you directly about the terms. About a resolution." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What kind of resolution did you have in mind?" He had not intended to say it so quickly. He had planned more groundwork, more careful architecture of language around it. But the room was very quiet, and her eyes were very direct, and the file with his name on it was sitting under her folded hands. "Marriage," he said. I am suggesting a marriage arrangement. One that would resolve the outstanding debt and secure the Hartwell estate. In exchange, I would offer my name, my title, and everything that accompanies it." He stopped. In the silence that followed, he heard himself. Heard exactly how it had sounded. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the desk drawer, withdrew a single sheet of paper, slid it across the desk toward him with 2 fingers, as though it were something that did not require much force to move. He looked down at it. The Hartwell account. Fully itemized. Every payment, every default, every note in his solicitor's hand, and her grandfather's red ink. £312,000, plus accrued interest. Final. "You are not offering me a marriage, Your Grace," Clara said. Her voice was even. Not angry. Worse than angry, precise. "You are offering me a transaction. You are proposing to purchase a resolution to your financial difficulties, with a title I did not ask for, and a name I did not need." As she stood. She was not tall, but in this room behind this desk, she was something else entirely. "I have dealt with enough transactions," she said. "My grandfather built his entire life around them. I grew up watching men slide papers across tables at each other and call it an agreement. I know what an agreement looks like, and I know what it is worth when the only thing holding it together is mutual convenience." She moved to the door and opened it. Not rudely. Simply, conclusively. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." Edward picked up his hat from the chair. He walked to the door. He stopped when he was level with her, close enough that he could have said something quietly, something real, something unscripted. He could feel the pull of it. He didn't. He walked out. The oak door closed behind him. On the pavement, in the London afternoon, he stood for a moment with no particular direction in mind. Then he began walking. He didn't go back to his club. He walked along the river instead, for a long time, in no particular direction, thinking about a sheet of paper slid across a desk with 2 fingers, and a woman who had opened a door not in anger but in disappointment. That was the thing that stayed with him. Not the refusal. The disappointment. As though she had expected better of him, and he had confirmed, precisely and efficiently, that she was right not to. Margaret had her own social life, her own invitations, her own web of carefully maintained acquaintances. Clara had understood from the beginning that her cousin was not unkind. She was simply arranged around herself, the way that people who have never had real security arrange themselves. everything evaluated for its usefulness, every relationship maintained for its potential return. Clara had felt mild affection for her, and mild wariness in equal measure. After Threadneedle Street, she should have felt the wariness more acutely. She would think this later. She would think, I knew, and I didn't act on it, and that was careless. But she had been thinking about other things. She had been thinking about the expression on Edward Ashford's face when he heard himself say marriage in that room. The way he had stopped, not caught out exactly, but suddenly aware of the sound of his own words. As though something in him had recognized, a half-second too late, that the version of himself he had walked in with was not adequate for the room he was in. She had not enjoyed it. That surprised her. She had anticipated the moment for weeks, the transaction laid bare, the offer made in its real terms, the contrast between what he was proposing and what a real proposal might have looked like. She had been certain it would feel like resolution. It had felt like something being wasted. She put that thought away. It was not useful. The gossip column ran on a Tuesday. Clara was at breakfast when Margaret's note arrived, hurried, slightly smudged, the handwriting of someone who had written quickly and with feeling. You must prepare yourself. There is something in the Mayfair Register. I had nothing to do with it. Please believe me. Clara set the note down. Asked her housekeeper to bring her the Mayfair Register. It was a small column, third page, the section that specialized in the kind of rumor that was technically unverifiable and practically indestructible. She read it once. Then she read it again. It has come to our attention that an American visitor currently enjoying London's social season may not be the independent traveler she presents herself as. Those curious about Miss W., recently arrived from Boston, might do well to investigate the connection between her presence in London and the banking interests of her grandfather, a Mr. S. W., whose London portfolio includes several notable aristocratic estates currently in, shall we say, complicated circumstances. One wonders whether the season's romantic overtures are quite as spontaneous as they appear, or whether the Whitmore family has found a rather elegant method of acquiring what money alone cannot purchase. Clara placed the paper on the table. She sat with it for a long moment. Outside the window, London was doing what it always did, moving, noise, indifferent. She thought about who had access to the right combination of information. Her own name. Her grandfather's name. The connection between them and the banking portfolio. The implication of aristocratic estates in difficulty. The list of people who knew all of those things together was very short. Margaret's note had said, I had nothing to do with it. Clara thought about Margaret at the Pembury ball, turning to examine the floral arrangement the moment the laughter landed. Margaret in the best chair, unannounced, delivering news about the Duke's inquiries with the air of someone who had been first to know something and wanted credit for it. Margaret watching Edward cross the garden at Lady Fenton's and calculating, behind her pleasant expression, exactly what that pursuit was worth and to whom. I had nothing to do with it. Clara folded the newspaper, set it aside, finished her tea. She did not cry. She was not built for crying about things she had half anticipated. But there was something, a tiredness, brief and genuine, that passed through her before she put it away. She had come to London for her grandfather's business. She had not come to be a story in a gossip column. She had not come to be a strategy or a rumor or a question mark, beside a family name that had taken Solomon Whitmore 50 years to build. She wrote no reply to Margaret's note. Edward read the column at his club. Two men were already discussing it when he arrived. Not about him. They didn't know about him. They were simply entertained by the general principle of an American banking family attempting to buy their way into society. They thought it was funny. They said so. Edward set down his paper and left before they noticed he had arrived. He went home. He sat in his study. He thought about who could have planted the column. The number of people who knew enough his name, her name, the connection was very small. Prude, his own household, and Margaret Whitmore, who had been standing beside Clara at the Pembury ball and at Lady Fenton's garden party and who had, Edward now recalled, asked him 2 weeks ago at the Cavendish reception whether he found American women charming, in the tone of someone asking a question they already knew the answer to. He thought about Clara reading the column, that particular gray-eyed composure absorbing it. Whether she would know immediately, as he did, exactly where it had come from. He thought about himself, 4 nights ago, saying marriage in a Threadneedle Street office and watching it land exactly as badly as it deserved to. He thought about the column's language. One wonders whether the romantic overtures are quite as spontaneous as they appear, and how it reduced everything to calculation and acquisition and cold strategy. He thought, that is exactly what I did. I walked into that office and I proved the column right, before the column existed. He sat with that for a long time. Then he took out a piece of paper. He did not write a letter. He was not ready for a letter, did not trust himself to write one that said the right thing in the right proportion. He wrote 4 words instead. He looked at them, read them twice, folded the paper, sent it with his most reliable man, with instructions to deliver it to Miss Whitmore's rooms personally, to her hand, and to wait for no reply. I was wrong. Twice. Clara received the note at 4:30. She read it standing in the hallway, still in her coat. 4 words. His handwriting, she had seen it once, on a note in the Hartwell file, a letter to Prout about payment arrangements. She recognized it immediately. She stood with the note for a moment. Then she went to the fireplace in the sitting room. She held the paper over it, released it, watched it take the flame and curl and go. She stood there until it was ash. Then she went to her writing desk and looked at the invitation that had arrived that morning, Lady Ashworth's charity auction, Friday evening. She had been planning to decline it. London had felt, this week, like a place that required more of her than she was willing to give. She picked up her pen, wrote her acceptance. She was not done yet. She had not come this far and read every page of that file, and sat in her grandfather's chair in that office on Threadneedle Street, to leave London as a rumor in a gossip column. Solomon Whitmore had not raised a woman who left things unfinished. Lady Ashworth's charity auction was held on a Friday evening in the 3rd week of June, in the ballroom of Ashworth House on Grosvenor Square. It was considered, by those who organized such things, to be the most significant charitable event of the season, not because the causes were more worthy than others, but because the room was harder to get into. Lady Ashworth was 73 years old, had outlived 2 husbands and 1 prime minister she had personally disliked, and operated her guest list with the precision of a woman who had learned early that the quality of a room determined the quality of everything that happened in it. Clara arrived alone. This was deliberate. Margaret had sent 2 notes that week, one still claiming innocence regarding the column, one suggesting they attend the auction together, as though the first note had resolved the matter. Clara had replied to neither. She had dressed herself, dismissed her housekeeper for the evening, and walked out of her grandfather's rooms into the London night without anyone beside her. She wore black. Not morning black, that was a different thing entirely. This was a deep, deliberate black silk, simply cut, with her mother's pearls at her throat and her mother's earrings and nothing else. No extra ornamentation. No attempt to soften or qualify or apologize for the space she was about to occupy. She had chosen it carefully. If London wanted to make her a story, she would at least choose her own costume. The room registered her arrival. She felt it, the slight shift in temperature that moves through a crowd when something unexpected walks in. Conversations didn't stop. Eyes didn't stare. But attention moved, the way it moves in a room full of people who have been trained since childhood to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. Clara accepted a glass of champagne, looked at the auction catalog, found a seat 3 rows from the front, which was further forward than most unaccompanied women chose to sit, and sat in it with the ease of someone who had selected it on purpose. The auction began at 8 o'clock. Lady Ashworth presided from the front, with the calm authority of someone who had never needed a gavel to have a room's complete attention. The items were significant: art, jewelry, rare books, an Italian landscape that caused a minor bidding war between 2 men who clearly wanted to defeat each other more than they wanted the painting. Clara bid twice in the first hour. Small amounts. Feeling the room. The centerpiece of the evening was announced at 9, a commission from one of England's most celebrated portrait painters. A full sitting, full portrait, presented to the winning bidder within the year. The bidding opened. It moved quickly, 4 bidders, then 3, then 2 men who went back and forth with the controlled aggression of people who were no longer thinking about the portrait. Clara waited. She let them reach a number that had thinned the room's attention, the point where people were watching the 2 remaining bidders and had stopped watching everything else. Then she raised her catalog. Her bid was clean, decisive, a number that cleared both remaining bidders by enough margin that neither attempted a response. The room was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then Lady Ashworth said, with what sounded very much like satisfaction, "Sold. To Miss Whitmore." Clara did not look around. She noted the price in the margin of her catalog neatly and returned her attention to the front. Behind her, she could feel the room recalibrating. She did not need to see it. She had spent enough time in rooms full of people doing sums to know the sound of arithmetic changing. Edward had been standing at the back. He had arrived late, later than was polite, earlier than he'd intended, which meant he had spent 40 minutes at home changing his mind about whether to come at all. He had resolved it finally not with logic, but with the simple acknowledgement that the alternative was sitting in his study feeling worse than he already did, which was considerable. He had seen her the moment he entered. Black silk. Her mother's pearls. Sitting 3 rows from the front with her catalog and her champagne and her complete, infuriating composure. He had watched her bid. He had watched the room recalibrate around her, the shift in posture, the reconsideration in people's eyes, the particular social alchemy that happened when someone did something unexpected with such complete lack of ceremony that the room had no choice but to absorb it as fact. She had not looked around afterward. He thought she didn't do it for the room. He was not entirely sure he was right about that. But he thought it anyway. He found her during the interval, near the window at the far end of the room. She was looking out at Grosvenor Square, the dark trees, the lamplight, the movement of carriages below. She had her champagne. She heard him approach and did not turn immediately, which he had come to understand was not rudeness but something else. A choice about timing. Miss Whitmore. She turned, looked at him. Something moved across her face, brief, unreadable, and then she was composed again. Your Grace. He had prepared nothing. This was a departure from his usual practice, and he felt the absence of preparation acutely. But he had learned, in the past several weeks, that prepared things landed badly in her presence. She had a way of seeing around the architecture of a statement to the intention underneath it, and if the intention underneath it was insufficient, the architecture only made it worse. "I know it was Margaret," he said. A pause. "Do you?" "The column. I know it was her. I knew within an hour of reading it." Clara looked at him steadily. "And what did you do with that knowledge?" The question landed exactly where it was aimed. He held it. "Nothing," he said. "For 3 days, nothing. I told myself it wasn't my matter to correct. That it was between you and your cousin. That inserting myself would appear." He stopped. "Self-serving," she supplied. "Yes. And was it?" "Self-serving." "Partly," he said, "because she would see through anything less than that. And partly, I wasn't certain I had the right. After Threadneedle Street. After what I said and how I said it." Clara was quiet. Outside, a carriage moved through the square. "You had the right," she said finally. "Not because of me. Because it was true, and you knew it was true, and saying nothing made it false by omission." He looked at her. "I know. Knowing and doing are different things. I know that too." He had not intended to do it publicly. He had not, in fact, intended to do it at all. He had come tonight without a plan, and plans made in rooms were inadequate anyway. He had come because the alternative was the study and the ledgers and the cold fire. But he was standing in Lady Ashworth's ballroom, and the interval was ending, and people were returning to their seats, and he looked at Clara Whitmore in her black silk with her mother's pearls, and thought about the column and Margaret's calculated hand in it, and 3 years of debt, and 1 word at the Pembury ball, and a sheet of paper slid across a mahogany desk with 2 fingers, and something resolved in him with the quiet finality of a door closing. He handed his champagne to a passing footman. He walked to the front of the room. Lady Ashworth, returning to her position, noticed him immediately. She was not a woman who missed things. She raised 1 silver eyebrow at him, a question. He said quietly, "1 moment, my lady. If you would permit it." She looked at him for 3 seconds, the same duration, he realized distantly, as Clara's look at the Pembury ball. Then Lady Ashworth stepped aside. Edward turned to face the room. 300 people. The most connected, most attentive, most efficiently gossip-transmitting 300 people in London. Every word he said in the next 60 seconds would be reproduced, exactly, in 12 different drawing rooms by tomorrow morning. Good. He needed witnesses. He did not make a speech. He was not a man for speeches. He knew his own strengths, and a prepared, emotional address to a ballroom was not among them. He simply spoke. "I want to correct something," he said. His voice was even. "Carrying." A column appeared in the Mayfair Register this week concerning Miss Clara Whitmore of Boston. It was inaccurate. It was planted by someone with access to partial information and a particular interest in its effect. I know the source, and I am content to name her if pressed. A silence fell over the room that was almost physical. Miss Whitmore came to London on legitimate family business. She has conducted herself throughout this season with considerably more integrity than some of the people who have presumed to comment on her character. He paused. Myself included at the beginning. He did not look at Clara. He had looked at her enough. This was not for her, she didn't need it. She had walked into this room alone in black silk, and bought the most coveted item of the evening without requiring anyone's permission. This was for the room. For the 12 drawing rooms. For the record. That is all, he said. Thank you, Lady Ashworth. He stepped back. Lady Ashworth regarded him for a moment with an expression that contained, he thought, something that might have been approval, wrapped in several layers of aristocratic discretion. "Quite," she said, and returned to her auction. The room did not erupt. It was too well-bred for eruption. But it moved, a collective exhale, a turning of heads, the rapid low murmur of people who have just received significant information and are already transmitting it. Edward made his way back to the window. Clara was still there. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not composed, not the careful evenness she deployed like armor. Something underneath it, briefly visible. Something that looked, if he was reading it correctly, like the effort of not being moved. He stood beside her. They both looked out the window at the square. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. It will cause you difficulties. People will assume." "Let them," he said. "I have been letting people assume things that suited me for a long time. The difficulty makes a reasonable change." "You named Margaret," Clara said. "Or offered to." "Yes. She is my cousin." "She is," he said. "I'm sorry for that part." Clara looked out the window. "Don't be. She made her choice, a beat. We all did." He walked her home. She had not asked him to. He had not announced he would. They had simply left Lady Ashworth's at the same time, and the night was warm, and when he fell into step beside her, she did not object. They walked through Grosvenor Square and down toward Mayfair without speaking for a full 2 minutes. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have said enough difficult things to each other, that quiet has become its own form of communication. "My mother was English," Clara said eventually. He looked at her. "Her family disowned her when she married my father. He was American. Not titled, not landed. He had made his own money, which her family found worse than having none. She came with him to Boston and she never came back." A pause. "She died when I was 11. She never reconciled with her family. She never stopped being sad about England, I think. Even when she was happy." Edward was quiet, listening. "My grandfather blamed himself. He had introduced them. He always said that if he had been more careful, but she loved my father. It wasn't carelessness." Clara's voice was even, but something moved through it. "She used to tell me about the house where she grew up. The garden. A library with a window that looked over the downs. She described it so often I felt I knew it." "What was the house called?" Clara looked at him. "Whitmore Hall. Her family's name before she was her family's name. They sold it after she left, after it became clear she wasn't coming back. I don't know who bought it." Edward stopped walking. She went 2 steps further before she registered that he had stopped. She turned. He was standing on the pavement looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the social ease, not the careful control, not the shame of Threadneedle Street or the resolve of Lady Ashworth's ballroom. Something stripped. Something that did not know what to do with itself. "What is it?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I need to show you something," he said. "Not tonight. Tomorrow. Can you come to Hartwell House tomorrow morning?" "Why?" "Please," he said. It was the first time he had said that word to her. She felt it land differently than everything else. 10 o'clock, she said. She arrived at Hartwell House at 10 o'clock precisely. He was waiting in the entrance hall, not arranged behind a desk, not positioned for advantage. Simply standing, with a document in his hand and an expression that reminded her, disconcertingly, of her grandfather on the dock in Boston. As though he were about to give her something he had been holding for a long time. He brought her into the study. gestured to the chair across from his desk, sat down himself. He placed the document on the desk between them. She looked at it. It was a property deed, dated 2 years prior. The estate listed was in Wiltshire. She read the name of the property, Whitmore Hall. The room was very quiet. "I bought it at auction," Edward said. His voice was careful. 2 years ago. The estate had been on the market for some time. It was in poor condition. The grounds had been neglected. "I bought it as an investment, intending to restore it and sell it on. I didn't know the history. I didn't know who had lived there." Clara was looking at the deed. She was not composed. She was trying to be, and she was not quite managing it, which was the most honest thing she had felt in weeks. "I had begun the restoration," Edward continued. "The library is nearly finished. The garden will take another season." A pause. "The window in the library looks over the downs." Clara looked up. "It was always yours," he said. "I didn't know it, but it was. I'd like you to have it." He slid the deed across the desk. Not with 2 fingers. With his whole hand, placed flat on the paper, pushed toward her, the gesture of someone transferring something real. Something that cost him. She looked at the deed. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. "This is not a transaction," he said quietly. "I want to be clear about that. I am not offering this in exchange for anything. I am giving it to you because it is yours, and I should not have it, and that is the only reason." The room was very still. "You laughed at my accent," Clara said. "I know. In front of 300 people. I know. You walked into my office and offered me a transaction. I know." His voice did not waver. "I know all of it. I'm not asking you to forget any of it." "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird was doing something in the garden. London traffic distant. The clock on the mantel. "I don't know," he said. "Something less than forgiveness. Something more than this." He gestured at the space between them, the desk, the deed, the careful distance. "I don't know what to call it. I've been trying to find the word for 3 weeks." Clara looked at him for a long time. "Say it again," she said. "My accent. Say something the way you said it that night, and I'll call in every pound." Something moved across his face. A crack in it, brief and real. He almost smiled. She almost did too. She picked up the deed, folded it carefully, put it in her coat pocket beside her heart, where her mother's letters used to live when she traveled. She stood. "I will need to write to my grandfather," she said. "He will want to know about the house." "Of course. He will also want to know." She stopped. Looked at Edward with those gray eyes that had been measuring him since the Pembury ball, since before she knew him, since she had first seen his name in red ink, and decided that London was worth the crossing after all. "He will want to know several things." "I would welcome the opportunity," Edward said, "to answer them. In whatever form he prefers. He is not a sentimental man. So I have heard. He will ask you difficult questions. I expect so. And you will answer them honestly." "All of them." "Yes," Edward said. And then, because it was true and she would see through anything less, "I will try." Clara nodded slowly. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, the same position he had occupied at Threadneedle Street 2 weeks and a lifetime ago. She did not turn around. "The library window," she said. "The one that looks over the downs." "Yes. My mother said the light in the afternoon was extraordinary." "It is," Edward said quietly. "I've been working in there most evenings." The light lasts until nearly 9 o'clock this time of year. Clara's hand tightened briefly on the doorframe. Then she walked out. One season later. The wedding was held in September at Whitmore Hall. Clara's choice on every particular. The month, the location, the size, which was small, by the standards of a duke's wedding, and large by the standards of anything Clara had previously imagined for herself. 40 guests. The Wiltshire Garden, which had recovered beautifully over the summer under the attention of 3 very determined groundskeepers, and one extremely opinionated head gardener named Mr. Potts, who had opinions about roses that he shared whether or not they had been solicited. The library window opened to let in the afternoon light, which was, as advertised, extraordinary. Clara had spent the summer at Whitmore Hall. This had not been, initially, the plan. The plan had been London through July, Boston in August, a return in autumn for the ceremony. Sensible. Organized. The kind of plan that made sense on paper and dissolved on contact with reality. The reality was a library with afternoon light that lasted until 9 o'clock. A garden that needed her attention, or at least welcomed it. A window seat wide enough to work from, with a view of the downs that her mother had described so precisely that Clara sometimes felt, sitting there with her correspondence, that she was inhabiting a story she had been told before she was old enough to understand it. The reality was also Edward, who had taken to appearing in the library doorway in the early evenings with 2 cups of tea, and the expression of a man who was not entirely certain of his welcome, but had decided to risk it anyway. She had let him in. Eventually, she had stopped waiting for him to knock. They had argued 3 times over the summer. Properly argued, about the estate management, about a decision he had made regarding the tenant farms without consulting her, about a letter from Prout that she had read over his shoulder and had thoughts about. Each argument had been uncomfortable and productive, and had ended not with one of them capitulating but with something better, a position neither had held at the beginning, arrived at together. She had not expected to find that satisfying. She found it extremely satisfying. She did not tell him this immediately. She was still Clara Whitmore. Some things required time. Solomon Whitmore arrived from Boston on a Thursday, 4 days before the ceremony. He was 71 years old, built like a man who had spent his life making unmovable decisions, and he walked into Hartwell House with the air of someone conducting a final inspection of a property he was considering acquiring. He looked at the entrance hall, the proportions, the condition of the plasterwork, the quality of the light, with the same expression he used when reviewing a balance sheet. Noting what was there. Noting what was missing. Forming conclusions he would not share until he was ready. He shook Edward's hand for exactly 3 seconds. Said nothing. Then asked to see the accounts. Edward had the accounts ready. He had been ready for 2 months. He had also, on Clara's quiet advice, reorganized them in a format that would make the full picture immediately legible to someone who had been reading financial documents for 50 years. This had taken Prout 3 days and caused him considerable professional anxiety, which Edward had managed with patience that Clara noted and did not comment on. Solomon spent 4 hours with the accounts. He asked 17 questions. Edward answered all 17 honestly, including the 3 that were genuinely uncomfortable concerning decisions made in the first year of his dukedom that he would not make now, which he said plainly without dressing them in better language. Solomon listened to each answer without expression. He did not make notes. He did not need to. At the end of the 4th hour, Solomon closed the ledger. He sat back in his chair and looked at Edward across the desk for a long moment, the particular look that Clara knew well, the one that saw past the surface of a thing to its actual composition. You know, he said, I have been in this business for 50 years. I have sat across from a great many men who owed me a great many things. I am aware, Edward said. Most of them, Solomon said, spent the first hour trying to convince me they were something other than what they were. The second hour realizing it wasn't working. The third hour becoming resentful about that. A silence. You didn't do that, Solomon said. It was not quite a compliment. It was more like a notation. A fact entered into evidence. I appreciate efficiency. He stood, extended his hand again. This time he held it for 5 seconds. It was, in Solomon Whitmore's personal vocabulary of gesture, the equivalent of a standing ovation. That evening, Solomon asked to see the library. Clara showed him. She stood in the doorway while he walked the room slowly. The shelves, the restored plasterwork, the desk she had claimed as her own over the summer without anyone formally assigning it to her. He ran one hand along the windowsill. Looked out at the Wiltshire dark. Your mother loved this room, he said. He did not turn around. I know, Clara said. She described it to me many times. She described it to me too, a pause. After she left. She would write to me, not to her family, they had made their position clear, but to me. She wrote about this room. About the light. Clara was quiet. I should have done more, Solomon said. To reconcile them. I told myself it was their choice to make, that I had no right to interfere. That was not cowardice exactly. But it was not courage either. He turned from the window. Looked at his granddaughter in the doorway. She would have been glad, he said, to know you were here. Clara nodded. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. Then she would have had opinions about the roses. God, yes, Solomon said, with something that was almost a smile. Emphatic ones. They stood in the library together for a while, in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have always understood each other and have stopped needing to say so. The debt was restructured on the morning of the wedding. Clara had arranged it herself, over 3 weeks of correspondence with Mr. Finch at the Threadneedle Street office and 2 long letters to her grandfather that had been, she knew, the real negotiation, not about numbers, but about what the numbers meant and what she intended and what she was asking him to trust. Solomon had approved the terms in writing in his own hand, in the same red ink. Not erased, restructured. New terms, reasonable ones, with a repayment schedule that a carefully managed estate could meet over 7 years without destroying itself. The interest adjusted. The timeline realistic. The kind of arrangement that acknowledged what was owed without making repayment impossible. The difference, her grandfather had always said, between a lender and a creditor. One wanted the money back. The other wanted leverage. Solomon Whitmore had always been very clear about which one he was. When Edward saw the document, he sat with it for a long moment. He read it twice, set it down, picked it up again. Then he went to find Clara, who was in the library in her dressing gown, 3 hours before the ceremony, standing at the window that looked over the downs. The September morning was clear and still, and the light was coming in long and early across the floorboards. She had walked every day for 3 months. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know, she said. The terms are fair. They are what the account warranted, at present circumstances, with reasonable expectation of future management. Nothing more and nothing less. Clara. Don't, she said, not unkindly. Don't make it larger than it is. It's an account. It will be settled honestly, and it will be closed. That is what accounts are for. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him behind her, close enough that she was aware of him in the way she had become aware of him over the summer. The specific gravity of his presence in a room. "All right," he said. "Then I'll say only this: I intend to be worth the terms." She looked out the window at the garden. Mr. Potts had done extraordinary things with the roses. Her mother would have been, as Solomon had said, emphatic. "I know you do," she said. "That's why the terms are what they are." He stood beside her at the window. Neither of them spoke for a while. The September light was coming in gold and unhurried, and the grounds were waking up below them. Birds, the distant sound of the kitchen, a cart moving along the lane. "What is it like?" he said, seeing it for the first time. She had been thinking about this since the moment she had arrived in May. She had thought she would feel like a visitor. She had expected the house to feel like someone else's story, narrated to her from the outside, never quite hers to inhabit. It had not felt that way. Not once. She was right, Clara said. About the light. He looked at her profile. She was watching the garden with the expression he had catalogued over 3 months, the one she wore when something had arrived that she hadn't allocated space for. Something real. He had learned not to remark on it when it appeared. She was still Clara Whitmore. Some doors she opened herself, in her own time or not at all. "She would have liked you," Clara said. "My mother." "On what grounds?" "She had terrible taste in stubborn men." A pause, the considered pause she used when the next thing mattered. "She also had very good taste in stubborn men." It amounted to the same thing in the end. Edward was quiet. "Then, and you? What is your taste?" Clara turned from the window and looked at him. The full-look gray eyes, measuring, honest, not performing anything, not softening anything, not asking permission for what she actually thought. "Apparently," she said, "similar." She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went to get dressed. The ceremony was at 2 o'clock. Edward stood at the front of the garden and watched Clara walk toward him across the Wiltshire grass. She wore her mother's English lace, found in a trunk in the attic of this very house, in June by Mrs. Potts, who cleaned and whose husband gardened and who had cried silently for 5 minutes upon discovering it, and then brought it to Clara wrapped in fresh linen as though it were something sacred, which it was. The lace had required some restoration. Clara had sat with it herself, 2 evenings a week through July and August, with a needle and her mother's patience, which she had inherited along with the gray eyes and the capacity for silence and the particular stubbornness that Solomon called efficiency, and her father had called the best and most maddening thing about the Whitmore women. She had finished it the week before the wedding. Pressed it herself. Hung it in the window of the room that had been her mother's childhood bedroom, which Clara now slept in, so that the September light could move across it one more time before she wore it. Solomon walked beside her across the garden. Not giving her away, she had been specific about that, and he had not argued, because he understood that she was not a thing to be given and never had been. Simply walking beside her because she had asked him to, because he was the person she most wanted beside her for the first part, before she walked the last few steps alone. He walked well for 71. He always had. At the edge of the rose border where the path narrowed, she touched his arm briefly. He covered her hand with his for a moment, one moment, no more, and then she walked the last few steps alone. She reached Edward and looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched long enough to be noticed by the 40 people watching, long enough for Lady Ashworth, seated in the 3rd row and wearing an extraordinary hat, to permit herself a small, private expression of satisfaction that she would deny having experienced if anyone mentioned it. Then the vicar began. At the dinner afterward, Solomon spent 40 minutes talking to the cook about Boston fish chowder. He had discovered on his second evening at Whitmore Hall that the cook, a large, cheerful Wiltshire woman named Mrs. Carr, had once spent a winter in Massachusetts visiting a sister, and had formed views about American cooking that she delivered with confidence and considerable inaccuracy. Solomon had corrected her on 7 points. She had defended her position on 5 of them. They had reached agreement on 2. It was the most enjoyable conversation he had had in recent memory. At the wedding dinner, he declared her English chowder adequate. He meant it as high praise. Mrs. Carr understood this instinctively and was extremely pleased. Margaret had not been invited. She had sent 3 notes over the preceding months, the first defensive, the second apologetic, the third elaborately so, with the energy of someone who has spent considerable time constructing remorse and would like it acknowledged. Clara had read all 3. She had filed them without reply, which was its own kind of answer. Someday, perhaps. There were things between them that were not finished, and things that might never be, and Clara had made a private accounting of the difference. She was her grandfather's granddaughter. She understood that some debts resolved, and some simply changed form. The evening wound down slowly, the way good evenings do, guests departing in 1s and 2s, the garden lanterns burning lower, the September night coming in cool and full of stars over the Wiltshire dark. Solomon shook Edward's hand at the door for 7 seconds this time. Said nothing. Did not need to. Clara watched him go from the library window and felt the full complicated weight of loving someone who had always been there, who was getting older, who had handed her things she hadn't known she was missing and had never once asked to be thanked for it. She would write to him in the morning. She always did. At the end of the evening, when the last guests had gone, and the garden was lit only by the lanterns strung between the trees and the extraordinary Wiltshire stars, Clara and Edward stood at the library window. The room was exactly as it had been that morning, and in May when she arrived, and in all the years before she existed when her mother had sat in this same light and learned the shape of a world that would later refuse to keep her. It was hers now. Properly, legally, undeniably. The deed was in the desk drawer in her grandfather's handwriting, transferred cleanly and without condition on the morning she arrived in May. It had taken her a week to stop feeling like a trespasser, and another week to understand that feeling like a trespasser and belonging somewhere were not mutually exclusive. Home, her mother had once written to Solomon, is not where you start. It is where you stop being afraid to stay. Clara had stopped being afraid to stay sometime in June. She had not marked the exact moment. It had not announced itself. Edward said something quietly in her ear. She laughed. Loud. Real. Unguarded. The full laugh, the one with no interest in what a London ballroom considered appropriate, the one that had been in her all season like a river kept behind glass, deployed only in safe rooms with safe people, rationed against the specific gravity of a world that had decided, before she opened her mouth, what her voice was worth. It rang out across the quiet garden. It went up into the Wiltshire night and dissolved into the dark between the stars. There was no one left to comment. And if there had been, well, she had her grandfather's ledgers. She knew how to count. She had always known how to count. And she had decided, some time ago, on a night when she stood at a fireplace and held a forward note over the flame and watched it burn while deciding whether or not to leave London. She had decided that this particular, improbable, maddening, extraordinary thing was worth more than she had originally budgeted for. Considerably more. She was, after all, her grandfather's granddaughter. And Solomon Whitmore had not built 50 years of success by undervaluing good assets. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end, and for helping this channel pass 2,000 subscribers. That support genuinely makes a difference. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Write your city in the comments. I read them all and they mean more than you think. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Your support helps keep these stories coming and getting better with each upload. Reaching this milestone has been incredibly motivating. Honestly, you've made me very happy. Seeing your comments, your engagement, and your support gives this channel its energy and direction. Thank you for being part of it and for helping it grow. There are many more stories on the way, each one crafted with more care and detail than the last. Your presence here is what makes it all worth doing, and I'm looking forward to sharing the next story with you very soon.